Hey, everybody, and welcome to the next in our If I Knew Then CEO series, series of interviews with entrepreneur media and Comparably. I'm Jaaon Nazar, the co-founder and CEO of Comparably, and very happy to have today as a guest Andy Katz-Mayfield, the founder, co-founder, and CEO of Harry's. Hey, Andy.
Hey, Jason, how you doing?
Great, and thank you so much. As we were talking about, I am a big fan. I am a customer. I was using your shaver this morning. This is a series of conversations we're having with incredible CEOs of public companies, of fast-growing private companies, where we're just talking about the journey that they've been on and the key lessons that they've learned. As many of you know, I'm a serial entrepreneur. I'm an LA native. I sold my previous company to Intuit today. I started and run Comparably, which is an employee review platform. We help companies with their employer brand and recruitment marketing, and we have data on 60,000 global companies. I'm an active investor and board member, and I've had the good fortune of learning from a lot of incredible CEOs in my career, and I know I'm going to learn a lot from Andy today. And so, Andy, I think most folks out there are going to know the Harry's brand. There's certainly going to be a lot of folks that are already customers, but maybe in your own words, if you could kind of give an overview of the company today.
Yeah, happy to do that. So, our company today, I could start at the present and then maybe go back to the past and its roots. But our company today is we're probably best known for the Harry's brand. But the overall company is really, our vision is to build a diversified omni-channel CPG company. And what that means is that we've got a family of brands, and we've got the Harry's brand, which is a men's care brand rooted in shaving, and that's our roots. But we've got body wash and bar soap and hair care and hair styling products and a broader portfolio. We have the Flamingo brand, which is a woman's body care brand, also rooted in hair removal across shaving and wax, but have a lot of exciting products like body moisturizer under that suite as well. We've got Cat Person, which is a brand that is really trying to provide high protein, premium, pet food, cat food specifically for cat parents and accessories. And we've actually got another brand that we're going to launch early next year. And so, what ties these brands together is that they all are sort of rooted in direct to consumer. And fundamentally, I think all of these brands and products and experiences were driven by a realization of some real unmet consumer need in the marketplace, and trying to create a solution as broadly defined, whether that's brand, whether that's product, whether that's value, whether that's the actual sort of shopping experience, to better meet that unmet consumer need. And that was really where the company started. It started with the Harry's brand. It started in shaving. It started with me being in a drugstore and just having a really frustrating purchase experience, and quite frankly getting sort of ripped off and not having any choice, and literally like wandering around the store trying to find somebody to come unlock the case that the razors were locked away in. And the reason they're locked away is because they get stolen all the time, and the reason they get stolen all the time is because they're so absurdly overpriced. And just kind of a realization that, hey, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better solution. A brand that resonates more with me, high quality product, a better customer experience, better value. And that was how Harry's got started. And that's kind of the underlying philosophy across our entire brand portfolio and family of brands, and kind of that core thing that ties together our vision of creating this modern day CPG company.
Yeah. It is so odd that the only thing in the drugstore that's actually locked away is the razor. You think it was like the crown jewels.
Yeah, you literally, exactly. You feel like you're like buying, expensive jewelry, and it's absurd. Which I think, and that like experience and emotion around it. I think in the early days of Harry's, when I was batting around the idea and talking to folks and guys and women too. People are like, yeah, that's crazy. Like, that's like, I hate that. I hate that experience. Like, I'm not happy with and it might've been a more latent concern in the broad scheme of concerns in people's lives, but like felt like a real pain point that we could do something that would fundamentally, improve upon the status quo. I mean, the mission of our company is create things people like more, which is very simple. It's just this idea of like, hey, can you actually improve upon the status quo? And that's an opportunity where we felt like we really could. And again, that's sort of like the North Star for us as we think across the entire sort of consumer packaged goods landscape of, there's lots of areas where you're like, well, what, like this just isn't really hitting the mark and maybe we could do it better.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's so impressive about your story is that, this is your first entrepreneurial venture. You started this company, I think, in 2012. And here we are, 8 years later, and you have more than 1,000 global employees. One of the things I wanted to know to start is, how did you know to make that jump? Like I know you had gone to Stanford Business School, you had worked in the MBA, you had done consulting, you were working in a BD role here at this great company, Brighter in Los Angeles. How did you know that you were going to be an entrepreneur and you were just waiting for the right time and idea? Or what was that defining moment that kind of gets you to take the leap at that point in your career?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't always know that I was going to be an entrepreneur. Like I wasn't the, kid in high school that had some, side hustle and was like always trying to figure out how to, make some money or do something on the side. I think what I recognized early in my career, and I started my career on a pretty traditional path. I worked in management consulting right out of undergrad, and then I worked in private equity investing. And I don't begrudge those experiences at all. They were actually great sort of foundational experiences in learning about business in different types of ways. But I found myself like, most happy and energized when I was working in a consulting context, either side by side with a client, in a private equity context, actually with a portfolio company. And when you're sort of more arm's length, whether it's providing advice or providing capital, I was just more energized by the idea of sort of actually kind of building and operating. And so I sort of got a sense early in my career that I was going to get more energy from being part of an operating company, and ideally something where there was building and growth to be had. And yeah, I was fortunate enough to go to Stanford and sort of immerse myself in, I guess, the beating heart of entrepreneurialism in probably the world, at least the country. And it convinced me that I wanted to be part of that ecosystem. It did not convince me that I wanted to sort of start something on my own, but the idea of being part of a, earlier stage team or growing something. And then, the Harry's idea happened organically. It was a bit serendipitous where, sure, I was considering, should I start my own company or, should I pursue something? And it was kind of the confluence of working in an earlier stage environment at Brighter, as you mentioned, and kind of getting, the guy that I worked for was a serial entrepreneur. So getting a taste for what that looked like in conjunction with just kind of right place, right time, right idea, and deciding that, hey, why not give it a shot?
Yeah. One of the things I'm really curious to get your take on is, what was critical about, your scholastic success in the journey that you had, and maybe what wasn't, and I'll give a little bit of context. So, you went to Duke, you went to Stanford for business school, like two amazing universities. Obviously, you must have been a great student, hardworking, applied yourself. I went to grad school, I went to business school and law school at Pepperdine here in LA. And I've often said that if I had to do it over again, I probably would not have gone to grad school and just try to start a bigger company earlier in my life. And I actually started my first business right out of college. So I've never actually worked for anybody unless somebody buys a company that I start. But one of the things I really want to kind of pick apart is, obviously there were things that going to Duke and Stanford gave you competitive advantages, right? And I want to know what those are and why people should be motivated to go down a path like that. But on the other hand, what do you feel like are the things that you don't need to have an Ivy League education to build a big, huge business on? And how do you think about that journey as it relates to the success that you and the company have today?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think that, I can certainly reflect on some of the positives of having those set of experiences, and then, where maybe whether it's negatives or just you don't need that type of an experience to kind of get to where you're going. I mean, I think on the positive side, look, fundamentally, I get a lot of utility personally from just being surrounded by smart people who are going to, challenge my thinking, going to push me to think about things differently, ideally come from, a diversity of different backgrounds and disciplines. And so, somebody who's like a brilliant doctor versus somebody who's a brilliant lawyer versus somebody that's, public policy or traditional business, and just being in those types of environments, I find really stimulating and what causes me to sort of think differently or develop a new perspective. And so I think, being in environments like that where there's just a lot of smart people, I think can be really beneficial. More pragmatically, there certainly is, networks and connection and privilege that comes from being a part of those environments, that can be really helpful and getting doors and access to investors and all of that sort of stuff. And so that does have some pragmatic utility. And I would say, this has become increasingly less the case since the many years ago that I was an undergrad, but, there's, still some stamp of credibility that kind of goes on your resume. I think the sort of converse of that is that it can, it sets you down a path that I think in some ways can sort of have in their nature, which is like a level of risk averse. Get the credentials that gets me to the next step. But I think it creates this like fallacy and narrative around like, what are the right things to actually do to like get to some ultimate destination versus like just a set of experiences that, are enriching and, maybe it's not as linear of a path to where you want to go. And so, in some ways, and that might be my own psychology to some extent, but I do think that type of a, sort of linear path can in some ways make it harder to just say, hey, I'm going to try this. I'm going to get this experience. And it can become a little bit one-dimensional in that regard. So, hindsight's 2020. I'm fortunate and grateful for the experiences that I had, but it does come with downside as well, I think.
So let's talk about that first year that you started the business, because my guess is you had been someone that had always had success. Scholastically, you did really well in your career, had great positions, and I don't know anybody that gets through their first year of a business unscathed. And so what was the transition to an entrepreneur? And what do you feel like in hindsight, you were least prepared then that now about that first very, beginning journey of starting a company?
I mean, I think, I guess two things come to mind. One is having not been somebody who had actually, operated before. There is just a level of tactical, like just the list of things you just have to do and get done, which, is, can be overwhelming, and it's not sexy most of the time. It's like, oh yeah, I got to go to this, call this guy to get I remember literally to maybe make a specific example, like driving from New York to rural Pennsylvania to like effectively cajole this guy over the weekend to like continue painting these little silver things on our like original prototypes because like we didn't get them on time for the factory. And like, it's not particularly intellectually stimulating work, but it all those like, effort and details and getting things right is really, really important. Even though it's not sexy. And so learning to sort of value that type of work, I guess, and lean into that and not sort of, just be like, well, that's not strategy. That's not like intellectually stimulating. It's like, cool, well, there's nobody else to do the work. So like, you better figure out how to do it. So I think that was, a challenge. I think the thing that was probably the biggest challenge, honestly, was like trying to find some level of like emotional stability, because and this is obviously, talked about a lot and a bit cliche, but my experience was very much the cliche, which is that the like roller coaster is intense. And, you wake up one day, like, ready to take on the world. And the next day you're like, wow, like not only is this business going to work, but my life's going to fall apart and everything's going to be wrong. And if you can't figure out how to like manage that, it can really be exhausting. And I think, even, I would say a reasonably even keeled person, if you ask people that know me, but even for me, that was like a really difficult thing to do. And trying to figure out how to, not let the lows get too low and the highs get too high, and keep some perspective, is something that I certainly struggled with a lot in the early days, and, I've gotten better at over time, but it's just emotionally exhausting.
Yeah, I think that's the underlooked part. I'm so glad you brought it up. I've often said that, one of the most important things that, we can do, especially in those early stages, is to have a peer group of founder CEOs. Because you know how it is, Andy, like you're not going to go to your own employees and say everything that's on your mind. You certainly aren't going to go to your investors. A lot of times you don't even want to go to your spouse or partner. But so to have a group of, folks that are going through the same experience, don't have a dog in the fight, aren't judgmental about things positive or negative, just to share the experience with it is one of those things I think that helped me take that burden, and lighten the load a little bit. One of the things I want to dive into is, how you put together this CPG company. Like you didn't have any background in this. So here you are, right? You were doing a BD role, and then all of a sudden you're like, well, I'm going to build a razor, and billions of dollars are spent by huge organizations like Gillette, and they've tried to perfect this over, however many decades. What was the experience like for you of having to figure out how to get that product built? And what do you feel like was your beginning of your product market fit? Like what was the differentiator, in that first year of the razor? Was it around cost or quality or design that helped you get an inroad with the market that already had such established incumbents?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And yeah, just to sort of finish the thought, because what you said at the end of the last question sort of resonated with me, which is that I do think that, the shared experience is one of the real benefits, at least that I've had, of having a co-founder, because there is really somebody next to you who's going through the same thing who you can talk to. And I did actually at one point join a, for lack of a better term, like CEO kind of, self-help group effectively. And having those types of networks is really, is valuable and a very tactically helpful way to help lessen the sort of emotional and cognitive load. But yeah, to answer your question on like, how did I figure out and learn how to do this, having really no relevant background or experience? I think that I would say that as it relates to like consumer generally brand, whether it's CPG or, everybody's a consumer at the end of the day. And so, there's real magic to how do you like execute a brand well, but there's not actually a lot of magic to empathy at the end of the day, which is kind of like, I was that consumer in the drugstore that was like, this doesn't make sense. This sucks. Like, and everybody goes through those experiences. And I think it's being able to sort of package that into something and saying like, okay, well, what would I do differently or better? And that part I think is just, yeah, it's sort of empathy and intuition around, that any consumer could have. I think the magic is like, well, great. How do you turn that into like a product and a brand? And there, I think, tried to surround ourselves in the early days with a lot of great talent and expertise. So, on the brand itself, as a specific example, my partner and I, like, we put together effectively like, a bunch of, pages that sort of described what we wanted the brand to be in words and, adjectives we wanted it to represent and not, and imagery that we liked and all of that sort of stuff. but then finding a partner who's like, okay, I can actually take that, and I've been a creative for 15 years, and I can actually turn that into the brand itself, and the aesthetic and the look and feel. Like clearly that's, I mean, I've learned through experience over now, the course of 10 years and a little bit more. I could never do that from scratch, to be very clear, but I have a little bit better sense of like, hey, that's good, that's not. But I think really surrounding ourselves with expertise, whether it's around the brand. We were fortunate to partner with like really great industrial designers out of the gate, and these were folks who we had to sort of. It was just an idea at that point. So it was like, great, here's a vision. We didn't have any money. So it's like, we'll pay you a little bit, but like give you some equity and hope for the best. And surround ourselves with people that were great. And I guess the second part of your question of like, what was really important and resonant is like, I think that, the simplest equation for like the Harry's brand in the early days was value, but value is kind of, we had some like equation effectively that was like, brand equity times quality divided by price effectively is like, that's some way that consumers think about value. They don't think about it explicitly that way, but that's kind of what's going in the equation when you think about value. It's not just price. Like you can find great value in Apple products and they're super expensive, but because the product experience is amazing and the brand's amazing. And so I think we tried to break it down into those subcomponents and say, look, yes, we want to deliver a better price than what's out there because that's a pain point. But we also want to create a brand and experience that resonates more with who we are as consumers. And some of that is like the aesthetic and the actual, having something that you'd want to put on your sink and be proud of. Some of that is sort of the, more like the emotional value proposition of the brand and being a little bit, sort of more, I would say, mature and progressive in the way that we speak to guys versus the way that a lot of CPG brands were marketing to men at the time. And then, direct to consumer for us, I think allowed us to provide this just really like human personal experience. And yes, I mean, it was more convenient than like going to the drugstore, but like Amazon Prime is pretty convenient too. And maybe that wasn't as ubiquitous 10 years ago, but I don't think D2C is like so much of like a channel play as it is a play to create this like touch point where you can create this like really human personal relationship with consumers in a way that enables them to just take a lot more joy out of the overall experience. And so the magic was some combination of all of those things. It wasn't any given one, but it sort of, I think, equates in consumers' minds to like, I'm getting great value out of this thing, but value's got a bunch of those different components in it.
Yeah. So I want to get a little bit of your fundraising advice, and we're going to go backwards, but to start, and I think this is public, how much total capital have you raised to date so far?
It may be embarrassing for me to say I don't actually know the exact answer to that question because it has been a lot. I think the answer is like maybe 400 million, including debt, something in that range. But we have taken not a capital light approach to building this company, and partially for us that was a function like very early on we vertically integrated and bought this factory that made our products. Which was not something that was necessarily I would recommend, or was like, it's pretty specific to shaving as a category where just supply is really constrained, and to really deliver a high quality product, you sort of need to control the end-to-end supply chain. So we had to raise a lot of capital early to do that. And then we've raised a lot of capital over time, honestly, to sort of build our platform and our infrastructure, which, we needed to support the Harry's brand, but, making all of those investments just to support the Harry's brand might not have been, the most, financially rational thing to do. But it was with this broader vision in mind of like, hey, a lot of the infrastructure we've built and capabilities that we have can power multiple brands over time. So both the vertical integration and the sort of platform building have required a decent amount of capital.
Yeah. The stats team here at Harry's have given me the figure of 375 million. So you were pretty close.
There you go. I was reasonably close.
Yeah. And obviously a unicorn valuation. So congratulations on the success. Let's go back to the beginning. Do you remember how much you raised in that first round that you did?
I do. It was like our seed round was, I think, $4 million when like all was said and done.
So what did you have to accomplish? Where did you need to take the business to before you were able to raise that first round? and maybe just talk about getting that first round across the line. How difficult was it? How many meetings did you have to take? And what do you feel like if you were giving advice to a first time business, that initial seed round of capital, what advice are you going to give her based upon the experience that you lived through? And let's talk about that first round of capital you had to raise. And then I want to pull out some more or less.
Sure. So my advice might actually be different from my experience. I can talk about what the experience was first, and then maybe what I would replicate or not. First, I should caveat by saying, like, I was fortunate because my co-founder is also a co-founder of Warby Parker, and Warby Parker in 2012, when we were raising capital, is not Warby Parker today, but it had some traction and some momentum, and so there was an ecosystem around that gave us some built-in credibility and access to investors that probably made our process easier than it would be, otherwise. So I should caveat by having a little bit of self-awareness on that front. And then, I think the way that we approached it, though, that sort of helpfulness aside, was, we needed, felt like we needed a brand and we needed a product. And so we did spend a lot of time really working on the brand, trying to, make that come to life in a way where, people could look at it and understand the value proposition and the resonance of the brand. And then, of course, if you're doing something in consumer, like, people want to try it. And so, we needed a physical prototype of the thing, so that people could literally touch it and feel it and shave with it. And so that was kind of the approach that we took, which is like, hey, if we've got a brand and we've got a product, and a little bit of thoughtfulness about how we might go to market, like, hopefully that's enough to, convince investors that, hey, this is a good idea that we should get behind. I know the sort of capital has, the definition of a seed round has crept up over time in Series A. So maybe a $4 million seed round today doesn't sound that outlandish, but in 2012, it was actually a crazy seed round to raise. Like, most seed rounds were like, $500,000. And the reason we raised a lot was partially because we needed to, actually bringing something that is like a performance-based product to market does require some capital, and we need to invest in inventory and invest in product development. So some of that was just sort of like, required to get to that level. But I would say that, I think that, it's reasonably inexpensive now to launch brands in general, and particularly if it's not a really high performance product, like a razor, like shaving razor blades. And so, I do think, maybe I don't know if we could have gotten away with it, but, I think trying to, take a kind of minimum viable approach and raise a little bit less capital to sort of try to prove yourself out over time. I mean, just from a pure dilution standpoint, like, well, the math will be better. But I also do think it creates some, like, discipline and benchmarks along the way, even for yourself, not just investors, of like, okay, do I really need the $200,000 to prove this out? Or is there a way I can do that on 50 grand and get to where I need to get and prove a little bit more, both to give myself conviction, but then also to give investors conviction, which should enable them to deploy capital at more attractive prices. So I wouldn't say our approach was like exactly what I would recommend to replicate, but it wound up working out. So I guess that's fine.
Well, I think you hit on, for me, really the key advice of raising that seed round, which is, I often say that the 5 principles of raising early stage capital: people, product, progress, persistence, passion. The number one is people. And I think the mistake a lot of early stage entrepreneurs make is they fall in love with their idea so much, and they think they're going to convince everybody of their idea, and they don't solve for the 2 P's that matter most, which is people. Like, a seed round is mostly done based upon the team.
That's right.
And if more folks put more energy into developing this world-class team, and certainly, could get co-founders that, already had credibility with investors, it goes so much farther than trying to convince people of the merits of your business. And then progress, just showing, like, as you said, you didn't go with an idea for a razor, you built something and people could touch and see and feel it. and understand the brand you were trying to build. I think, there's very few folks, that have had the opportunity to raise as much capital as you have in a period of time. And each stage is so different. Like I haven't raised more than a Series B. I've been on boards of companies where we've raised, up to $100 million. Like, what do you feel? Let's start off with the basics. Obviously, you have to have a good business, a good product. Okay, putting that aside for a moment. Like, why have you been able to have so much success in fundraising? And the entrepreneurs that are able to raise, 100 million plus, 300 million plus, what do they do in the fundraising process that's different and better than other entrepreneurs that do struggle to raise growth rounds?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think, obviously the business fundamentals are the most important thing. And it's not just the fundamentals of the business as it currently exists, but I think it's being able to sort of create a compelling vision and narrative, because ultimately deploying massive amounts of capital from an investor standpoint is fundamentally contingent on a belief that the company can continue to grow and scale. And so, and so not just having like, a sort of fluffy vision on what that looks like, but like, if you have a clear vision for where you want to be in 3 or 5 years, like, having like a pretty thoughtful set of like building blocks of how to get from here to there that feels sort of defensible and underwritable, I think is, particularly important at like a growth stage. Because, at that point, I would agree with you that, you're still betting on people, but, as opposed to like a seed round where it's truly like, who knows? Like, I trust this team is it's a reasonably good idea and the team's good, I'm in, that's certainly not how somebody who's going to put $75 million into a company is going to think about it. It's going to be a more, yes, okay, do we believe in the team? Are the business fundamentals solid? And do we think this thing can continue to sort of grow and scale? What I would say, first of all, I shouldn't be giving a masterclass in fundraising. I'd consider myself average. I'm not like a great salesperson. I've seen master fundraisers at work, and like, it is truly an art form. And I think are people fundamentally who are just great salespeople. And I don't mean that in like a sleazy sense, just people that have great conviction and ability to sort of, sell, a vision for the future. For me, that's not really my leadership style. I tend to be, pretty direct, pretty sort of transparent and clear. And actually, I think the best advice that I got early on in fundraising, which maybe has been effective for me, and I would say my co-founder sort of fits this as well, is that like, just be yourself. Like, don't try to be, if you're not the like, visionary salesperson, like, don't try to do that, because it's going to feel shallow and inauthentic. And like, for me, like, I don't really know how to do that. All I know how to do is like, I don't know, here's a business, here's what's here. Let me do your diligence for you. Here's the things that are great. Here's the things that like actually aren't great and you ought to spend some time on. And here's how I think about it. But like, I don't know, reasonable people could disagree and whatever. And, is that the value maximizing approach to fundraising? Like, maybe not. But what I do think, it's authentic to me and my style. And so I think it comes across that way. And I do also think that, at the end of the day, investors are smart. And if you can kind of, give a balanced, honest perspective and build trust in a relationship through that process, I actually think that that's valuable. And in some ways, okay, people might fall out of the process as a result, but that's okay. You might not have wanted those people to invest anyways. Like, I think you want investors who understand your business, like, pros and cons and get it. And are, you're not sort of selling them a bill of goods that isn't quite exactly the full story. And so, that is the approach that we've taken over time. And like I said, I can't say that it's the masterclass value maximizing approach, but I do think what it's done is enabled us to raise capital from people that truly understand our business and are like aligned to the journey and the vision. And so, and I'm not somebody that believes that capital is just a commodity. Like, I am somebody that believes that it is really important to have a cap table and a group of investors who are values aligned, who get the vision, who are going to be, with you through the ups and downs. And I do think it's enabled us to, our approach has enabled us to surround ourselves with people who do get it and who are on our team and there for the long haul. And I think that makes the day to day, once the check's already been written, like, much smoother as a result.
Yeah. All right. So let's do the time machine here. And this, obviously we've already gone into a bunch of lessons that you've learned. And I love that piece of advice, to be yourself. It's hard. It's hard to do that. Like that, my best friend is a stand-up comic, and there's this whole idea that it takes 10 years on stage just to talk in your own voice of how you sound off. And I think one of the big components of fundraising is exactly what you hit on, which is just be authentic, be yourself, paint the big vision. I love how you point out, hey, this is what you should look into. Like, I feel like I'd try to do the same thing. So I want to do the time machine exercise with you here. So if you could take a time machine and you could go back into your 20s at any point and you could talk to that Andy, what professional advice are you going to give him, and why?
I think I would, maybe it's probably related to a little bit when we were talking about sort of my educational background, which is that, I think I was focused in my 20s on collecting a bunch of like resume credentials and really focused on like, all right, how do I get promoted into the next step? And this thing leads to that thing. And the advice I would have given myself is like, focus on collecting like a set of experiences, not a set of like resume credentials. And so I think ultimately, that like, if I was interested in, early stage growth, like, okay, I went to business school, that, and I had a great experience and wouldn't change anything about that. But like, I could have just gone and worked for an early stage company. That probably would have been a more valuable experience than going to business school, just being perfectly honest. And, business school maybe was like a better resume credentialing thing, to use a specific example. So I think and I see that, certainly with more junior folks in our company today, where it feels like, okay, I'm junior and I got to do this, this, and this to get to this thing. And I think what I've realized with the benefit of time and hindsight is like a career is a marathon, not a sprint. And if you think about, the early days is really about collecting experiences. It's like a better frame through which to view decisions.
All right. So let's say you could go back into your early 30s. I don't exactly know how you look like you could be 30, so I don't want to make any assumptions.
I'm in my late 30s now.
Yeah. All right. And maybe as the company started scaling. So, right, if you could go back to that period, or you pick any time. But I think one of the things that's interesting to me is like, hey, you're in Harry's now, it's starting to have some success and grow. If you could go back and give yourself any personal or professional advice, what would be at that point in your career and why?
Certainly, I guess a lot of folks, there's always this risk calculation and risk aversion. And I mean, there are true entrepreneurs that are risk seeking, but that's like a rare breed. I think that's like a misconception that entrepreneurs are like risk seeking people. Most people tend to be risk averse. Entrepreneurs might have a little bit of a different gauge than other people, but you're still trying to mitigate risk along the way. But if you think about that in the context of like career, I do think, I actually had a business school professor who was like, what is the one thing you would do if you knew you wouldn't fail? Just do that. That's like the best career advice.
That's an amazing mental framework. What would you do if you knew you couldn't fail?
Yeah. And then it's like, that just takes the risk piece out of it. And you're like, okay, well, I'd do that. Like, well, why don't you just do that? And I think that the overarching point that human beings do sort of tend to be cost or the idea of like, well, but what would success look like? And so I think, that I think that was helpful for me in my early 30s as I was trying to figure out, like, do I start a company? Do I, great, I did the Stanford thing. Now let me go work for a hedge fund or whatever, not to begrudge anybody who made that choice, because that's a very personal choice. But, that for me probably wouldn't have been the thing that was the most energizing or exciting. And then I think, in the early days and in scaling, I think, there's a lot of, I guess, self-criticism or you're like not equipped. And obviously like I have pretty high expectations for myself, and like, oh, I screwed that up, or I didn't, that went wrong. And way that you get good at this stuff is like through experience. Like there's nobody that's like born a great CEO. Maybe there are, but like it wasn't me. Like, and I'm probably sorry, most people aren't. And like these different steps along the way, like you just have to go through them, and like you're going to screw up, and you're going to say the wrong thing in a company meeting, or you're going to send the wrong email, or you're going to make the wrong product decision. And like, very few of these things are truly, existential, but you sort of tend to beat up on yourself and be like, oh, I screwed that up. Like, I was so dumb. Like, and I think it's like, you sort of look at, there's obviously these like successful entrepreneurs that are like put on pedestals and maybe seem like, there are these brilliant people that never made mistakes along the way. You're like, they screwed up all the same stuff that I screwed up, I think, for the most part. And so just kind of understanding that you have to go through those experiences, and that's part of like the learning journey.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it back to that. And I really want to go back to what you talked about earlier, is the emotional roller coaster. There was a piece I wrote in the Wall Street Journal in 2009 called The Unintended Consequences of Startups. And I started my last venture-backed business in 2007. I think I was 27 years old at the time. And I threw myself into it, Andy. Like I made a promise that I was going to not fail for a lack of working hard. And so we were working, yes, I'm sure, you were, maybe still are, like 15, 16-hour days regularly, and 6 days a week. And I gained 55 pounds. I think I was 175 pounds when I started the company, and got up to like, 225. I didn't see any friends for the first 2-3 years. I just became completely myopic about building this company. And, for me, I think what I was not prepared for was the emotional toll it was going to take to make that level of commitment. And it's something that not a lot of people talk about, or I feel like didn't as much 10 years ago, because, anytime you were at a cocktail party, anything less than saying, oh, I'm killing it, felt like, you just weren't part of the club of folks doing well. And so, I think there's this very real unspoken component of founding the company, which is that it is very, very lonely. And it's an experience that sometimes is hard to share with your partner and spouse. You don't talk to your, employees about, obviously, this is the value and benefit of having a co-founder. And I've had amazing co-founders in my last company and now Comparably. So you share that with them. But, especially as the founder and CEO, it's just a different, set of experiences you're going through. And I think, being as prepared as possible for the fact that there's going to be that roller coaster. And the best piece of advice I was ever given was, don't struggle with the struggle. And that stayed with me till this day. Know who you've learned the most from. So who's someone that was an important mentor to you, and what piece of advice did they give you? And I specifically want to know a second person, but someone who works for you. Because one of the most enlightening things I found is the advice and counsel that you've learned from, not from somebody outside that's more successful from you, but someone that's been on your team or is on your team that you learned a lot from.
Yeah, no, both good questions. I think what you said resonates. I would say that it's maybe weird to, or not weird, but like, if you think about a mentor, you usually think about some like, gray-haired, wise person, that's kind of bestows advice on you. And I've certainly got some of those in my life, and that's helpful. But, I think week in, week out, it's actually my co-founder is sort of my mentor in that regard, because I think, he brings a very different style and energy, which I'm able to sort of learn from. He is much more the sort of extroverted, rah-rah, and has, different ways of processing problems and information. And because of this sort of uniqueness of the co-founder relationship too, like is also able to give me a level of unadulterated feedback and perspective on what I'm doing. That's just would be hard to get, somewhere else. So if I actually was being honest, like who I've learned the most from in the last 10 years and who's helped develop me the most, it would actually be Jeff, who's my co-founder. And we're not just, we were like co-CEOs too. So we've truly been like co-pilots for 10 years at this point, and have known each other since I guess, for 18 years. We worked together, previous to business school and consulting and private equity. So we go back a long way. Yeah, I think, what I've, in terms of the second part of your question, which is like, who have you really sort of learned from in the company? There's probably a couple of individuals who, because I didn't have the background of actually like running a business or operating or like doing stuff, as I sort of refer to it colloquially. It's like, I don't know how to do anything. Like, I just know how to like make PowerPoint slides. Looking like, kind of the just learning a ton from like, sort of process, and like, here's actually how you, it sounds unsexy, I guess, but it's like, here's how you actually bring a product to life. And so, there's a woman, who actually sort of, runs, like sits over the Harry's brand and a bunch of stuff at this point, but like, who came up, through our R&D organization, Britannia, who, is fundamentally, somebody that like creates product and kind of just like learning, like, how do you go from idea to inspiration to then like, actually bringing something to life, there is a creative piece to it. And I think, oftentimes when people look at product or brand, they assume there's just kind of like this magical thing that comes to life. But the best sort of creative sort of like product people that I know, yes, they have like amazing, sort of ability to think and inspire and all of that, but they're also really disciplined about process and like really know how to like bring things through and stage gate. And so kind of, I've learned a lot from her specifically, but I would say from, people like that in our organization generally, who are like creators and builders. So that's been a real benefit of being in my seat as well.
Awesome. What are the characteristics you most look for in hiring, and what's any advice you'd have to other folks that are hiring a lot of folks of how to identify and recruit top talent? One of the things that I struggle with after 20 years of hiring a lot of people is, I still think that the traditional interview process and sitting across a conference table or doing Zoom calls, I just never know who's going to be the right fit. I know who's not going to be the right fit. I often tell this to my team. I know who's not going to be a good fit for us. I don't know who's going to be a great person. And so short of getting the chance to work with somebody for a while, and so whenever anybody's in between a role, I always say, hey, come do a 2-week engagement with us, do a month engagement with us, because I just feel like that is where we learn so much about a candidate. I'd love to know what the 3 or 4 most important characteristics are that you're looking for in your talent, and any hacks you have around how to identify and hire the best folks in organizations.
Yeah. Well, I would start with saying that, it's an imperfect science. And so anybody that sort of tells you that they've, got it fully figured out is like, I don't know, probably the best recruiters in the world maybe have a 70 or 80% hit rate or something like that. Like you make mistakes in this stuff. So I think that that's just, if you're to level set sort of baseline expectations, like you're never going to get it entirely right. I think with that said, like, there is, I think, some science to the process, and, it's identifying functional expertise is in some ways, easier. And there certainly we, well, at our scale now, we've got lots of experts in the company. And so like, okay, if we're hiring somebody in R&D, like we've got 5 really talented people in R&D that can, with pretty great precision, identify whether a candidate is like good enough at like the functional part of the job or not. I think what is often trickier is like what you sort of referred to as fit. And I think what we've tried to do there is like make that as explicit as possible. And so for us, what that means is that, we've got 4 values as a company. I won't belabor with you with all the details of what they all are, but what we do is then we've got actually a bunch of like interview questions that we think like ladder to those values. And when we put together an interview panel, we have people whose job it is literally to evaluate somebody on one of our values is all in all together. And one of our values is, embrace the mammoth, and like, and they come back and they've asked people these 4 questions and they're calibrated and they give somebody a score.
Can I ask what those questions are? And I think it's great to hear the value. So I would love to know the values, and then what are some of those actual specific questions, that you ask to help ladder to the values?
Yeah. So I'll give you an example. So one of our values I mentioned is all in all together. And the idea there is fundamentally that, somebody who really is willing to sort of subjugate their ego for like the greater good of the team, and is therefore going to be like work well cross-functionally and, support their colleagues, et cetera. So, idea of like real like collegiality and like sense of the collective. And so one of the sort of tricks that we use, or it's not a trick, it's just a mechanism that we use to try to evaluate that, is we'll ask people for, a pretty standard interview question, which would be like, all right, give me an example of something like you accomplished in this role. But then when you like listen to the way that somebody describes that accomplishment, and, are they using I language or we language? And that's like a real tell. And so if somebody's like, well, I did this and I did that and I did it, like, it doesn't mean that they're not all in all together, but it's then it's a yellow flag, at least, and something that's a need for kind of further exploration, which is somebody that's kind of, saying we a lot and saying, well, like, yeah. And then you might drive and then you're like, oh, and it was actually your idea. It wasn't like the team's idea, but you actually have to like dig that out of them. And so that's like one value in one specific, question, but it does sort of take it from like a subjective analysis to a little bit more of an objective, question of, and again, it's all like, are there people that use I language that would be an amazing fit on that dimension? Like, sure. And that's where it comes into like, it's only 70 or 80% accurate at the end of the day, but you do start to, get a more objective, or increase your chances of hiring the right person. I would also add that tactically, I think what you said, in roles where it's possible, that like test driving is a great approach, and on both sides, because, you want to make sure it's a fit and they want to make sure it's a fit too. So we've certainly brought in lots of folks to the company that way too, where it started as like a contract or consulting engagement, and you kind of see if it's a fit. So that's obviously not always like a possibility, but where it is, that's also tactically, I think, good advice.
Do you have any other go-to interview question? Like one of there's 2 I always ask in an interview is what if what we offer is what they're looking for, and later on, if I have to sell the candidate on working with us, I want to know what that is. The other thing that I'll do is I'll ask questions like, rate your work ethic on a scale of 1 to 10, or, well, give me an example of that. And I always get skeptical when someone's like, well, I'm a 10 out of 10, but the example of their work ethic is that, they're staying at the office until 5:30. Like, well, that feels like, to know from you, like, what's one of your key go-to questions that you.
One of the things that I always find interesting, but it is more of a tell of like what really motivates people, is like, I tend to like ask, let's say, a specific role of like what gave you energy in that role? Like, what were the thing where you like woke up in the morning and you were just like, I'm pumped. This is going to be a great day because I'm doing this thing and whatever. And then conversely, like where you like, ugh, like, it's like, I know this is part of the job, and oftentimes the people that I'm interviewing are, more, I guess that was true at an early stage too, although I also interviewed a lot of junior people, but I think it really helps me get me a sense of like what really motivates people at the end of the important, and they've got great functional expertise, but like, and I'm asking them questions about like what gives them energy, and they never once mention like, mentoring their, direct reports, or being one-on-ones with yellow flag, like we should probably dive a little bit deeper there. So I find that like
All right, well, I'd love to chat for a second about, what you do to build a great company culture. Up here, you've got great scores from your team and employees. So, obviously you're doing a lot right. Like, people are finding a ton of great experiences, foster a great company culture. And, obviously it's so different from when you were early on and 20, 30, 40 folks and you were together to have 1,000 employees and have them based all over the world and so many in Germany. It poses so many more challenges. And so what's your playbook for how today you build a great company culture at Harry's?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the soft side, I think, fundamentally we try to be, particularly as the company is scaled, like as transparent and honest and open as we can be. And I think that creates and as sort of leaders in the way that we communicate things and share out financial results and, bring people into the tent on the way we're thinking about strategy and the future of the company. And I think that both builds like trust when you're sort of open and transparent, but probably even as importantly, it's like just gives people context in which to like do their jobs better. And I think if you want to give people, to me, the like, sort of nirvana is like, where you've got folks that have like a lot of agency and autonomy, but they're able to be effective with agency and autonomy because they have context and they have a vision and they have like a North Star. So I think that's one thing. I think that we've tried to be really explicit about values. And that is the way that we are able to sort of maintain cultural consistency. So it's not just about naming the values. So that's a starting point, because in the early days in a company, a lot of these things are just implicit. And, we started sort of Harry's and then at some point we're like, well, we went through a few different iterations of it, but then we went through a process to actually try to sort of name and put words to these things that like felt true, but like actually codifying it. And then I think the next step from that was then saying, okay, well, we're actually going to select talent based on these values. We are going to reward people based on these values. We're going to promote people based on these values. So it has kind of teeth too. So I think that's kind of the probably the most important thing, particularly as you're scaling, to like create consistency. And people always be like, well, how do you not screw up the culture and have things change as you scale? That to me is the most important thing to kind of hold sacred and to be explicit about. And then like, I'm also somebody that believes pretty strongly, like, you've got to sort of like measure stuff and it's hard. How do you actually assess culture? And it's like, well, we actually measure it. Like we run a biannual engagement survey that's pretty detailed and it's, very, very specific scores. And we look at like where we're scoring well and not, and where we're not scoring well, it's like, okay, well, if we focused on these 3 areas and made progress here, it's going to improve our engagement score. And, that's obviously a more direct level of, measure of employee well-being, but it's a pretty good proxy for like how good your culture is or how strong the culture is. And so, we're pretty dogmatic about measuring and tracking and getting that feedback loop so that, we're able to improve in areas where we're not as great. And obviously we're not perfect and no company is, and there's always going to be room for improvement. And those improvement areas are going to evolve based on where the stage of the company is. So kind of tracking that, in a more measurable way over time has been helpful for us.
What are you most excited about the Harry's business today? Obviously, you've got these multiple different brands and lines servicing all sorts of different customers, a lot more product SKUs than you did when you originally started. I think it's an incredible brand, a ton of loyalty from your customers. What are the big things in the future that you're most excited about?
Well, I think from like a company standpoint, we've had this vision of being, this multi-brand platform and, family of brands over time. And, for a long time, that was a vision and a pipe dream. And it was sort of the Harry's brand, and the Harry's brand was mostly shaving. And I feel like we've finally kind of gotten to a level of, escape velocity effectively, where we've got this platform, we've got this team, we've got 3, soon to be 4 brands, we're actively looking to to acquire brands, to bring them onto the platform. And so, this idea of kind of being like, the next generation P&G or Unilever, feels like not just a pipe dream anymore, like a reality. It's here. So that's energizing and motivating because, that's not something that's like, in 3 years, we're going to be like, okay, great. We did that. Like, I don't know, P&G was built over 100 years. Like I could do this basically, for as long as I'm working. And so, and still have growth and opportunity. So that's exciting. And I think for us, the proxy is like, we are motivated. When I say we, I mean, it's me and my co-founder, I guess, fundamentally, but our team broadly by having impact. And, the most direct way to sort of think about that is obviously back to the mission of like create things people like more, which is great. We're improving our customers' lives. We're giving them, a better shaving experience or a better shower experience or, better food for their cats, depending on whatever the thing is. And that is motivating. And then I think, but we also, I think, fundamentally view our company and our platform as like a force for good, a force for like positive, impact on our employees, giving people an environment where they get a sense of purpose, where they can grow and learn. And then a positive impact on, the community as well. And we donate, 1% of the revenue from our brands to, nonprofit partners. And obviously the bigger our business gets, the bigger that 1% gets. And for the Harry's brand, we're specifically focused on mental health and have been able to have like real impact there. Like we had a goal of, providing better mental health access to 500,000 men. And we've already exceeded that goal and given millions of dollars. And so, so it feels good that we've had that impact to date. But I think about continuing to scale and have that, it feels like we can, move the needle and create things people like more, not just for like our customers, but also for our employees and also for the community more broadly. So I think that's fundamentally what gets me up in the morning.
Yeah. Well, part of our values as a company is, obviously transparency. And I got to say, one of the things that I think is so special and unique about you, Andy, is just how transparent you are, right? Sharing like these lessons and hard times you went through. And you talked about the importance in fundraising of being authentic. And, I think for you to share about the, mental ups and downs, in the early days, how you're having to drive to Pennsylvania to get, whatever you need to get done to get those early product SKUs ready. And I think for, you all to be an organization and leaders that, live these values and are giving so much money back to mental health issues and helping so many folks, it just says so much about you. And I was an avid consumer, before we spent some time together. And even more so now because I think the mission and what you're doing is really special. And I'm excited to see your 100-year journey of how you take on the Procters and Gambles of the world and all the product lines you're going to come out with. I know there are a lot of people today that are going to be better off for getting to hear your perspective and advice. So thank you for taking time out of your day and spending, this hour with us and sharing all your amazing perspective.
I really appreciate it and happy to have spent the time. Hopefully something in there is useful, but no, I appreciate it, Jason. Thanks for having me.
You got it. And thank you for everybody that joined us. Again, our next interview is going to be with the CEO of GoDaddy. So we're going to have some more great folks coming and joining us. And Andy, again, continue the journey. We're all excited to see what's going on. I think maybe the next product you can combine it. So maybe it's razors for cats. So it's a very niche market.
You're not the first person to have pitched us that idea. So we'll see. We haven't quite figured out the cross sell there, but I'm sure we'll figure it out eventually.
Yeah. And thank you all. Stay safe, stay sane, and be well during this holiday season. And best to everyone out there. Thank you so much, and thanks again, Andy.
Thank you.